On the 4th day of June, 1942, the vast Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a sky that promised nothing but clear horizons. Yet those waters concealed a maelstrom of steel and fire that would reshape the entire war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the battleship Yamato, his eyes scanning reports that spoke of overwhelming Japanese superiority, but in his heart, a gnawing unease persisted like a persistent shadow refusing to yield to the light. The Kido Butai, Japan's fearsome carrier strike force, sailed toward Midway Atoll with confidence born from 6 months of unbroken victories across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies, from Wake Island to the Solomon Sea. Commander Mitsuo Fukida, who had led the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, prepared his aircrew aboard the carrier Akagi with the same meticulous attention that had brought such stunning success on that infamous December morning. The Japanese combined fleet had assembled the most powerful naval armada ever dispatched by the Empire, comprising 4 fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering. The plan seemed flawless. Strike Midway, draw out the remaining American carriers, and destroy them in a decisive engagement that would force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters celebrated premature victories, already planning the next phase of expansion that would establish an impregnable defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Newspapers proclaimed the invincibility of Japanese arms, while citizens lined the streets to honor departing warriors who embodied the spirit of Bushido. The military leadership, intoxicated by their string of conquests, believed that American resolve had been shattered at Pearl Harbor, and that one more crushing blow would break their enemies' will entirely. Yet 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, waited northeast of Midway, positioned by intelligence intercepts that had given Admiral Chester Nimitz the most precious commodity in warfare, knowledge of his enemy's intentions. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor had accomplished the seemingly impossible, cracking the Japanese naval code J-25 and revealing Yamamoto's entire operational plan. This achievement, documented extensively in naval intelligence archives and later detailed in publications, such as the Naval War College Review, provided the Americans with a decisive advantage that would prove more valuable than any number of ships or aircraft. The Japanese fleet approached Midway with divided attention, forced to prepare for both a land assault on the atoll and a potential carrier engagement. This operational confusion, born from Yamamoto's complex multi-pronged strategy, would prove catastrophic when split-second decisions became matters of life and death. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo, commanding the carrier strike force, received contradictory orders that reflected the fundamental weakness in Japanese planning. They expected to control the battle's tempo, unaware that the Americans had already seized the initiative through superior intelligence and were waiting to spring their trap. As the sun rose over Midway on the 4th of June, 1942, the first wave of Japanese aircraft launched from their carriers at 4:30 in the morning, their engines roaring to life in a coordinated symphony of mechanical power that had become the trademark of Japanese naval aviation. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima B-5 Kate torpedo bombers, 36 Aichi D-3 Val dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters toward the tiny atoll that represented America's fragile foothold in the Central Pacific. The strike force departed with confidence, leaving behind reserve aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs specifically prepared for anti-ship attacks should American carriers appear. On Midway itself, radar operators detected the incoming raid at 5:53 in the morning, providing precious minutes for American defenders to scramble their aircraft and prepare for the onslaught. Marine Fighting Squadron 221, equipped with obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters and slightly more capable Grumman F-4F Wildcats, climbed desperately to intercept the attackers. Major Floyd Parks led his outmatched pilots into combat against the legendary Zeros, and the sky above Midway became a savage arena where American courage confronted Japanese skill and superior equipment. The Japanese attack on Midway's installations proved devastating but incomplete, destroying buildings and fuel stores while inflicting casualties among the garrison, yet failing to neutralize the airfield completely. Lieutenant Tominaga radioed back to the fleet at 7 o'clock. There is need for a second attack. This message would become one of history's most consequential communications, triggering a fatal decision aboard Admiral Nagumo's flagship. The admiral faced an agonizing choice: continue holding his reserve aircraft armed for naval combat or rearm them with land attack ordnance for a second strike against Midway. Meanwhile, American torpedo bombers and dive bombers from Midway launched desperate attacks against the Japanese carriers, flying outdated Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo planes and Martin B-26 Marauder medium bombers that had never been designed for naval combat. These attacks achieved no hits but served a crucial purpose. They forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver violently, disrupting their operations and buying precious time for the American carrier strike groups approaching from the northeast. 6 Navy Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 8 Detachment made their combat debut, with only one surviving the withering defensive fire from Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. At 7:15, Admiral Nagumo made his fateful decision: rearm the reserve aircraft for a second strike on Midway. Aboard Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, ordnance crews frantically worked to remove torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with land attack bombs and incendiaries. The hangar decks became cluttered with live ordnance, violating safety protocols in the rush to execute the admiral's orders. Then, at 7:28, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone finally reported the presence of American surface ships to the northeast, adding the ominous detail: enemy ships are accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The announcement electrified the Japanese flagship like lightning striking a powder magazine. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming halted and reversed, demanding the aircraft be restored to anti-ship configuration. Chaos erupted on the hangar decks as exhausted crews attempted to switch ordnance for the second time in less than an hour, with torpedoes and bombs lying unsecured on the decks. At 7:45, the first wave of aircraft returned from Midway, desperately low on fuel and some damaged, requiring immediate recovery. Nagumo faced an impossible situation: his decks cluttered with ordnance, his reserve strike force unprepared, and American carriers somewhere beyond the horizon. At 7:52, on that pivotal 4th of June, 1942, Admiral Nagumo's carriers began recovering the Midway strike force while simultaneously attempting to prepare a coordinated attack against the newly discovered American carriers. Commander Fukita, injured during the Midway raid, watched helplessly from Akagi's bridge as precious minutes slipped away, understanding better than most that time had become the enemy's greatest weapon. The Japanese carriers sailed in a tight rectangular formation, Akagi and Kaga in the front, Hiryu and Soryu behind, presenting excellent mutual defense against air attack, but also concentrating their vulnerability in a small area of ocean. Aboard the American carriers Enterprise and Hornet, Admiral Raymond Spruance had launched his strike groups early, gambling that attacking at maximum range would catch the Japanese with aircraft on deck. Commander Wade McCluskey led Enterprise's Air Group 6, while Commander Stanhope Ring commanded Hornet's Air Group 8, with Yorktown's aircraft launching later under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. The American strike groups faced their own challenges: inadequate fighter escort, unreliable torpedoes, outdated aircraft, and the enormous difficulty of locating the enemy fleet across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, departed from the main strike group, following Waldron's instinct rather than the briefed course. This decision, born from the commander's studied understanding of Japanese tactics and his determination to find the enemy regardless of orders, would lead his squadron directly to the Japanese fleet. 15 Douglas TB Devastator torpedo bombers flew low over the water, their crews knowing they were obsolete, slow, and vulnerable, yet pressing forward with a courage that transcended any rational calculation of survival odds. At 9:20 in the morning, Waldron's squadron found the Kido Butai, and what followed became one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in naval aviation history. The Devastators began their attack runs, flying straight and level at low altitude while Japanese Zeros descended upon them like hawks upon field mice. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with deadly black bursts, and one by one the American torpedo bombers fell into the sea. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, watched his squadron mates die around him before his own aircraft was shot down, leaving him floating in the water near the Japanese fleet, where he would witness the battle's climax. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 and Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 followed, launching their own desperate attacks against the Japanese carriers without fighter protection. The Zeros and anti-aircraft fire proved devastating, shooting down 24 of 31 attacking torpedo bombers without a single hit being scored on any Japanese ship. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 to destruction, while Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's Torpedo Squadron 3 suffered similar annihilation. The sacrifice seemed futile, the attack suicidal, yet those brave men achieved something more valuable than any torpedo hit. They drew every Japanese fighter down to wave-top height, clearing the skies above for what was about to unfold. High above the slaughter, Commander McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise searched desperately for the enemy fleet, their fuel running critically low as the briefed intercept point revealed only empty ocean. At 9:55, McCluskey made the decision that would change the battle's entire trajectory. He would search to the northwest rather than turn back. At 10:20, a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the fleet appeared below, and McCluskey followed its wake like a hunter following tracks to the prey's den, leading his 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers directly to the Kido Butai. At precisely 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Commander McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attack runs from 14,000 feet, beginning a descent that would culminate in 5 minutes of destruction so complete that it shifted the entire balance of power in the Pacific. Below them, the Japanese carriers turned into the wind, preparing to launch their strike force against the American fleet, their decks crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft that represented months of training and irreplaceable combat experience. The scene presented a perfect target for carriers vulnerable, their combat air patrol drawn down to sea level by the torpedo bomber attacks, and their crews focused on launching operations rather than defensive maneuvers. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Bombing Squadron 3 from Yorktown arrived simultaneously from a different vector, having navigated independently to the target, creating a coordinated attack that the Japanese had no chance of countering effectively. According to detailed accounts preserved in the official Navy Department communiques and later analyzed in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive History of Naval Operations, this convergence of two separate dive bomber groups represented extraordinary fortune compounded by professional skill and individual initiative. The Japanese lookouts spotted the diving aircraft too late, managing only brief warnings before the first bombs fell. McCluskey's first section targeted the carrier Kaga, and the results proved catastrophic beyond anything the Americans had dared hope. Lieutenant Dick Best led the second section against Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, while Leslie's squadron struck Soryu with equal devastation. The 1,000-pound bombs penetrated wooden flight decks and detonated among the aircraft, ordnance, and fuel lines that cluttered the hangar decks below. Secondary explosions rippled through all three carriers as torpedoes cooked off, aviation fuel ignited, and ammunition magazines exploded in sympathetic detonations that no damage control team could contain. Aboard Akagi, a single bomb struck just behind the midship elevator, penetrating to the upper hangar deck where it detonated among aircraft being armed for the strike against the American carriers. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and triggered a chain reaction among the stored ordnance. Within minutes, fires raged out of control throughout the carrier, forcing Admiral Nagumo to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. Commander Fukita, severely injured, watched his ship die around him, knowing that Japan's 6 months of triumph had ended in mere minutes. Kaga suffered 4 direct hits that transformed the massive carrier into a funeral pyre for 800 men. The first bomb struck near the bridge, killing the ship's captain and most of the senior officers instantly. Subsequent hits detonated among the aircraft on the flight deck and penetrated to the hangar deck, where fuel and ordnance created an inferno that consumed the ship from within. The carrier's steering failed, leaving her circling helplessly while fires engulfed every deck. By evening, the order to abandon ship was given, and Kaga slipped beneath the waves at 7:25, taking with her the pride of Japanese naval aviation. Soryu received 3 hits in quick succession from Lieutenant Commander Leslie's squadron, and the carrier's fate was sealed as rapidly as her sister ships. Lieutenant Joe Ichi Tominaga, who had led the morning strike on Midway and returned to find his carrier under attack, chose to join the counterattack despite his aircraft being damaged and unable to release its ordnance. His sacrifice embodied the warrior spirit that animated Japanese naval aviation, yet courage alone could not overcome the tactical disaster that had befallen the Kido Butai. Soryu burned fiercely, eventually sinking at 7:13 that evening with devastating loss of life. Only Hiryu remained operational, having been separated from the other carriers by several miles, and her captain immediately prepared a counter-strike against the Americans. Yet 3 of 4 fleet carriers had been destroyed in 5 minutes, and with them went Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific. The aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months were gone, along with the irreplaceable pilots and aircrew who represented years of intensive training that Japan's limited resources could never adequately replace. At 10:40 on that catastrophic morning of June 4, 1942, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi aboard the carrier Hiryu received reports of the disaster that had befallen his fellow carriers. But unlike many Japanese commanders that day, he did not hesitate or seek further orders. The admiral immediately ordered an attack against the American carriers. Knowing that Hiryu represented Japan's last chance to salvage something from the debacle and perhaps inflict enough damage to force a tactical stalemate, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Aichi D-3 Val dive bombers and 60 fighters toward the American fleet, following the American aircraft back to their source like wolves following the scent of blood. The Japanese strike group located Yorktown at noon, the carrier distinguishable from her sisters by her different island structure, and Kobayashi's bombers pressed home their attack with the same skill and determination that had characterized Japanese naval aviation throughout the war. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire and defending fighters from Yorktown's combat air patrol, 3 bombs struck the American carrier. 1 penetrated deep into the ship, exploding in the smokestack uptakes and extinguishing fires in 5 of 6 boilers, leaving the carrier dead in the water. Another bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded on the 4th deck, killing or injuring dozens of men and starting serious fires. Captain Elliot Buckmaster and his damage control teams worked miracles, restoring power and bringing Yorktown back to 20 knots within an hour. But the carrier's reprieve proved temporary. At 2:45 that afternoon, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga's replacement, Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto, led 10 Nakajima B-5 Kate torpedo bombers in a low-level attack that demonstrated why the Japanese were considered masters of this most difficult form of aerial warfare. The attackers split into 2 groups, attacking from both sides of the carrier simultaneously to ensure that Yorktown's evasive maneuvers would still present a target to one group or the other. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, flooding compartments and causing a severe list that threatened to capsize the ship. The carrier lost all power, her rudder jammed, and fires broke out in multiple locations. At 3 o'clock, Captain Buckmaster reluctantly ordered abandon ship, believing the carrier was doomed. Destroyers moved alongside to rescue the crew while Yorktown settled deeper in the water, listing heavily to port. The carrier that had survived the Coral Sea battle and been rushed through repairs to participate at Midway appeared finished, floating dead on the water while her crew watched from rescue vessels. Yet, even as Yorktown fought for survival, American scout planes had located Hiryu, and Admiral Spruance ordered an immediate strike with every available aircraft. Enterprise and Hornet launched 24 Dauntless dive bombers from their depleted squadrons, and at 5 o'clock that evening they found the last operational Japanese carrier. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led the attack, and 4 bombs struck Hiryu, 1 hitting forward of the bridge and 3 more devastating the hangar deck, where aircraft were being prepared for a third strike against the Americans. Admiral Yamaguchi remained aboard his flagship as fires consumed Hiryu throughout the night. Refusing to abandon ship and accepting responsibility for the disaster that had overtaken, the Kido Butai, the Admiral and Captain Tomio Kaku chose to go down with their ship, a decision that reflected both personal honor and the devastating psychological impact of the battle's outcome. At 2:30 on the morning of June 5th, Hiryu's engineering officers reported that the fires had reached the magazines and all hope of saving the ship was lost. The destroyer Mekagumo fired torpedoes into the burning carrier, sending her to the bottom at 9:12 that morning. In less than 24 hours, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been destroyed, taking with them over 300 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and aircrew who represented the elite of Japanese naval aviation. The Kido Butai, which had seemed invincible just one day earlier, had been effectively annihilated as an offensive force, and with it went Japan's ability to conduct large-scale carrier operations in the Pacific. As darkness fell on the 4th of June, 1942, Admiral Yamamoto aboard the battleship, Yamato struggled to comprehend how his carefully planned operation had disintegrated so completely and catastrophically in the span of a single day. The Admiral, who had masterminded the Pearl Harbor attack and predicted that Japan would run wild for 6 months to a year before American industrial might turn the tide, now saw his prophecy fulfilled with devastating accuracy. Yamamoto initially ordered his scattered forces to concentrate for a surface engagement, believing that his battleships could overwhelm the American carriers in a night action, but reconnaissance reports made clear that Admiral Spruance had wisely withdrawn eastward, refusing to risk his precious carriers in a close-range slugging match with superior Japanese surface forces. Throughout the night, American submarines prowled the waters around Midway, hoping to intercept damaged Japanese ships or stragglers from the defeated fleet. The submarine Nautilus, which had survived depth-charge attacks earlier in the day after attempting to torpedo the battleship Kirishima, discovered the destroyer Arashi conducting an anti-submarine sweep. Commander William Brockman observed the destroyer racing to rejoin the fleet and unknowingly provided Commander McCluskey with the crucial clue that had led his dive bombers directly to the Japanese carriers, a connection neither commander realized until after the battle when intelligence officers pieced together the day's events from multiple reports and testimonies. At 2:55 on the morning of June 5th, Admiral Yamamoto faced reality and ordered a general withdrawal, canceling the Midway operation and directing all forces to retire westward toward Japan. The decision represented more than a tactical retreat. It marked the end of Japanese offensive operations in the Pacific and the beginning of a long, grinding defensive campaign that would ultimately lead to complete defeat. The combined fleet, which had sortied from Japanese waters with such confidence just days earlier, now limped homeward with 4 fleet carriers lost, a heavy cruiser damaged, and thousands of experienced aircrew dead or missing. Yet the Battle of Midway was not quite finished. The carrier Yorktown, abandoned by her crew the previous afternoon, remained afloat despite her severe damage, demonstrating the remarkable resilience of American carrier construction. Captain Buckmaster organized a salvage party that returned to the carrier on June 5th, and for a day it appeared the ship might be saved and towed back to Pearl Harbor. Damage control teams refloated flooded compartments, fought fires, and worked to reduce the carrier's list, accomplishing repairs that seemed impossible given the extent of damage. The Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, prowled the waters northeast of Midway, searching for any American carriers that might have been damaged in the battle. At dawn on June 6th, the submarine's periscope watch spotted Yorktown under tow by the minesweeper Vireo, accompanied by the destroyer Haman alongside providing power and pumps for continued salvage efforts. Tanabe maneuvered into attack position, penetrating the destroyer screen with remarkable skill, and at 1:36 that afternoon, fired a spread of 4 Type 95 torpedoes at the stricken carrier. One torpedo struck Hammond directly beneath her depth charge racks, breaking the destroyer in half and killing 81 men in the catastrophic explosion as her own depth charges detonated. 3 other torpedoes struck Yorktown, tearing open compartments that had just been sealed and flooding spaces that salvage crews had spent hours pumping dry. The carrier, which had survived bombs and torpedoes the previous day, and appeared likely to survive even that punishment, finally succumbed to this final attack. Throughout the night, Yorktown settled deeper in the water, and at dawn on June 7th, the carrier that had fought in more battles than any other American carrier rolled onto her port side and sank, taking with her the hopes of salvage, but leaving behind a legacy of courage and resilience. In the days following June 7th, 1942, as the last ships of both fleets returned to their bases, the full magnitude of the Battle of Midway became apparent to military planners and strategic analysts on both sides of the Pacific. The United States Navy had lost 1 fleet carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men killed, losses that, while painful, could be replaced by America's enormous industrial capacity and population. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 men killed, losses that represented an irreplaceable portion of the Imperial Navy's offensive power and combat capability. The human cost extended far beyond raw casualty figures, encompassing the loss of hundreds of experienced pilots, aircrew, and maintainers who represented years of intensive training in the demanding skills of carrier aviation. Commander Fuchida, recovering from his wounds in a Japanese hospital, realized that the Kido Butai's destruction meant more than lost ships. It represented the elimination of an institutional knowledge and combat expertise that could never be adequately reconstructed. Young replacement pilots might learn to fly and even to fight, but they would never match the operational proficiency of the veterans who had perished at Midway, and Japan's training infrastructure lacked the capacity to produce sufficient replacements for sustained combat operations. Admiral Nimitz, reviewing reports at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood that Midway represented more than a tactical victory. It had restored strategic balance in the Pacific and provided the foundation for future offensive operations. The admiral recognized that his intelligence services, particularly Commander Rochefort's code-breaking team, had made the victory possible by providing foreknowledge of Japanese intentions, allowing him to position his inferior forces to maximum advantage. The achievement vindicated the Navy's investment in signals intelligence and cryptanalysis, proving that information could be as valuable as ships or aircraft in modern warfare. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters attempted to conceal the extent of the disaster from the Japanese public, reporting only minor losses and claiming tactical success at Midway. Survivors of the sunken carriers were quarantined upon their return to Japan, forbidden from discussing their experiences even with other military personnel, while propaganda organs continued to proclaim Japanese invincibility. This deception succeeded in maintaining public morale temporarily but created serious problems for strategic planning, as even high-ranking officers outside the naval establishment remained unaware of how drastically the balance of power had shifted in the Pacific. The Imperial Navy initiated a crash program to replace the lost carriers, converting passenger liners and oilers into escort carriers while accelerating construction of new fleet carriers, but Japan's limited shipbuilding capacity and resource constraints meant that replacements would arrive slowly and in insufficient numbers. The carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, which had missed Midway due to damage and aircraft losses from the Coral Sea battle, would have to bear the burden of Japanese carrier operations for months to come. New carriers like Tiho and Shinano remained years away from completion, while converted vessels lacked the speed, aircraft capacity, and combat capability of the purpose-built fleet carriers lost at Midway. American shipyards, by contrast, began producing Essex-class fleet carriers and Independence-class light carriers at a rate that Japan could never match, with new vessels joining the fleet every few months throughout 1943 and 1944. The naval construction program that President Franklin Roosevelt had initiated before Pearl Harbor now began delivering results. flooding the Pacific with carriers, destroyers, submarines, and amphibious vessels that would enable the island-hopping campaign that gradually pushed Japanese forces back toward the home islands. Each new American carrier that entered service represented another nail in the coffin of Japanese naval aviation, while each loss, and there would be more, could be replaced by another vessel already under construction. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1942, the strategic implications of Midway became increasingly apparent as both nations adjusted their war plans to reflect the new balance of power in the Pacific. The United States launched its first offensive operation at Guadalcanal on August 7th, barely 2 months after Midway, demonstrating the confidence that victory had instilled in American commanders and their willingness to accept risks that would have been unthinkable before the battle. The landing of Marines on Guadalcanal initiated 6 months of brutal fighting that ultimately confirmed American superiority in the South Pacific and demonstrated that Japan could no longer maintain the defensive perimeter it had established in the war's first 6 months. Admiral Yamamoto, desperate to reverse Japan's deteriorating position, committed the combined fleet to supporting operations around Guadalcanal, hoping to catch American carriers in a decisive engagement that might restore the balance lost at Midway. The naval battles around Guadalcanal, Eastern Solomons in August, Santa Cruz in October, and the 2 battles of Guadalcanal in November demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation remained dangerous and capable of inflicting serious losses on American forces, but they also revealed that Japan could not sustain the attrition of ships, aircraft, and trained personnel that these engagements demanded. Each battle saw Japanese forces inflict tactical damage while suffering losses they could not afford strategically. The loss of the carrier Hornet at Santa Cruz in October 1942 left Enterprise as the only operational American carrier in the Pacific, creating a brief period of Japanese numerical superiority, yet even this advantage proved fleeting as new carriers arrived from American shipyards to redress the balance. The carrier Saratoga, repaired from torpedo damage, returned to service, while Essex, the first of the new class, completed her shakedown cruise and prepared for combat deployment. By early 1943, American carrier strength would eclipse anything Japan could field, and the margin would only increase as the year progressed. Japanese strategic planning increasingly focused on defensive operations, abandoning the ambitious plans for further expansion that had dominated thinking before Midway and instead concentrating on fortifying key bases and attempting to exact such a high price for each American advance that negotiated peace might still be achieved. This defensive strategy contradicted everything Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized about decisive battle and offensive action, but the reality of American industrial and numerical superiority left few alternatives. The Imperial Navy, which had trained for decades to seek and win a climactic engagement that would decide the war's outcome, now found itself forced into a protracted defensive campaign for which it was psychologically and doctrinally unprepared. Admiral Yamamoto's death on April 18, 1943, when American P-38 fighters intercepted and shot down his aircraft over Bougainville, dealt another devastating blow to Japanese naval morale and leadership. The mission, made possible by American cryptanalysts who had deciphered Yamamoto's itinerary, demonstrated that the intelligence advantage gained at Midway continued to provide crucial benefits to American operations. The admiral, who had conceived Pearl Harbor and understood better than most of his colleagues the true nature of American industrial potential, was gone, replaced by commanders who lacked his strategic vision and understanding of the enemy they faced. By mid-1943, the strategic transformation initiated at Midway had become undeniable as American forces advanced through the Solomon Islands, prepared for operations in the Central Pacific, and began planning the island-hopping campaign that would eventually bring them within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. Each American advance depended on carrier-based air power to establish local air superiority, suppress enemy defenses, and support amphibious landings, the same carrier-based air power that Japan had pioneered and perfected in the years before the war, but could no longer effectively employ due to losses at Midway and subsequent battles. The strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to the United States, and Japan found itself fighting the long defensive war that Yamamoto had warned would end in defeat. In the decades following the Battle of Midway, historians, military analysts, and veterans struggled to fully comprehend how a single day's fighting had so completely reversed the Pacific War's trajectory and transformed what appeared to be inevitable Japanese victory into the beginning of certain defeat. The battle became the subject of countless studies, books, films, and academic analyses, each attempting to identify the decisive factors that had led to such a lopsided outcome. Some emphasized the role of American intelligence in providing foreknowledge of Japanese plans, while others focused on the tactical decisions that had left Japanese carriers vulnerable at precisely the wrong moment, and still others highlighted individual courage and initiative displayed by American pilots who had pressed home attacks despite overwhelming odds. Admiral Nimitz, reflecting on the battle in his post-war memoirs, attributed victory to the combination of superior intelligence, courageous and skilled personnel, and a measure of good fortune that had brought dive bombers to the target at exactly the moment when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. The admiral emphasized that Midway demonstrated the importance of intelligence services in modern warfare and vindicated his decision to trust Commander Rochefort's analysis despite skepticism from some quarters. This assessment found support in subsequent historical research, including detailed examinations of Japanese planning documents and operational records that revealed how completely American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese communications. For Japan, Midway became a forbidden subject during the war years, mentioned only obliquely in official communications and carefully concealed from public knowledge through strict censorship and control of information. The defeat's psychological impact on Japanese naval leadership proved as devastating as the material losses, shattering confidence in the invincibility of Japanese arms and creating a defensive mentality that pervaded subsequent operations. The deception practiced by the Imperial General Headquarters in concealing the extent of losses ultimately harmed Japan's war effort by preventing realistic assessment of strategic options and creating false expectations about the balance of forces in the Pacific. The battle's tactical lessons influenced naval aviation doctrine for generations, demonstrating the vulnerability of carriers to air attack, the importance of combat air patrol management, the dangers of operational confusion and divided objectives, and the critical nature of damage control and ordnance handling procedures. Modern carrier operations incorporate numerous safety protocols and operational procedures that derive directly from lessons learned at Midway, where cluttered hangar decks filled with armed aircraft and unsecured ordnance had transformed Japanese carriers into floating bombs waiting for a spark to detonate them. On a strategic level, Midway proved that numerical superiority and technological sophistication could be overcome by superior intelligence, better positioning, individual initiative, and the willingness to accept high risks in pursuit of decisive results. The American victory demonstrated that wars are won not merely through material superiority but through the effective application of available resources, the intelligent use of information, and the courage to act decisively when opportunity presents itself. These lessons transcended the specific circumstances of Midway and influenced military thinking about the nature of modern warfare for decades to come. The individuals who fought at Midway carried their experiences throughout their lives, from Ensign George Gay floating in the water watching the battle unfold to the Japanese survivors quarantined and silenced about their experiences. Their stories, gradually revealed in the post-war years through memoirs, interviews, and historical research, provided personal context to the strategic and tactical analyses, reminding subsequent generations that great historical events consist ultimately of individual human experiences, decisions, courage, and sacrifice. The battle's legacy extended beyond military history to become a symbol of how determination, skill, and courage can overcome apparently superior forces. As the sun set on June 7, 1942, the carrier Yorktown slipped beneath the Pacific waves for the final time, joining the 4 Japanese carriers that had preceded her to the bottom in those waters off Midway. The battle had ended, but its consequences would reverberate throughout the remaining years of the Pacific War and beyond. Japan's high hopes, which had seemed so justified in the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, had indeed burned away in Midway's sudden and decisive retaliation, consumed by American bombs and torpedoes in 5 minutes of destruction that changed the course of history and transformed the Pacific War from Japanese offensive to American advance. The tiny atoll that had seemed so insignificant on maps became the place where the tide of war turned irrevocably, where strategic initiative changed hands, and where the final outcome of the Pacific War, though still years and countless battles away, became ultimately inevitable.